My guest today is Professor Jeffrey Erlich, who is a research fellow and group leader at the University College London. His research interests include neuroscience, cognition, electrophysiology, and neuroeconomics. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I got many of your papers, and I'm very interested in them, Jeff. So I did some work with humans, and I found humans to be somewhat suboptimal decision makers compared to mice and rats. So I want to talk to you about that a little bit. Uh, so I want to start with encoding of 2D self-centered plans and
Mm,
world-centered positions in the rat frontal orienting field, FOF.
yeah.
So you say here that neural mechanisms of motor planning have been extensively studied in rodents.
Yeah.
Preparatory activity in the frontal cortex predicts upcoming choice, but limitations of typical tasks have made it challenging to determine whether the spatial information is in a self-centered direction reference frame or a world-centered position reference frame. Yeah, I found this very interesting, Jeff. So my intuition would have been, we're talking about rodents here, and we talk about some humans later.
Yeah.
Um, my intuition would have been that tactically optimizing rodent will be sort of looking at self-centered direction. So what do we find here?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack. I think so. There's been sort of like two separate research subfields in neuroscience in a way. One, which is quite well known, the Nobel Prize was, I can't remember the year, I think it was 2005 or something, John O'Keefe and the Mosers got it for place cells and grid cells,
Yeah.
which are these kind of like world-centered representations. People called
Mm.
it like the GPS of the brain, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's generally situated in the hippocampus in the medial temporal lobe. On the other hand, there's this other network, sometimes called like the frontal parietal tectal network, which is in humans includes dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the frontal eye fields, which are this area in frontal cortex, which is important for spatial attention and eye movements,
Mm.
and then the parietal cortex, which is also important for attention, but also for, I mean, it's actually somewhat mysterious what it's for, but we know that uh, human patients who have strokes in the parietal cortex often suffer contralateral neglect, where they like can't attend to objects in the uh, hemifield opposite from where the brain damage is. And then the
Mm.
superior colliculus is this very old brain structure that uh, something like the colliculus exists in like insects, for example, which we
Mm.
know is like a kind of a mini brain that can do a lot of very sophisticated processing, but
Mm.
it tends to be very stimulus driven and very in the moment. So it's like kind of reacting to salient things in the world.
Mm.
So in the frontal cortex, it was sort of, I've been working on this on the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex for going on now more than a decade, and we were sort of following the monkey literature and the human literature and kind of presuming more or less that the representations there were self-centered.
Mm.
So in animals like humans and monkeys, we're we are very visual. And so the
Yeah.
center of our attention is the fovea. It's very narrow, right? It's like a few degrees. But a lot of animals don't have fovea, right? So mice
Mm.
don't have a fovea. They have like a central, and rats, they don't have a fovea. They have something called central vision, but they're not that visual. They're actually use their whiskers a lot, and they use smell a
Mm.
lot more.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's fish that use like electrical sensing. But
Mm.
no matter what sense you use, you're going to use that information to guide your attention, even if you're a fish, because you have to decide, am
Mm.
I going to swim to the left or to the right, right?
Yeah.
So even the simplest animals have this circuit where they can integrate different kinds of sensory information to guide attention. And this is a
Mm.
very old circuit where there's like these frontal parts of the brains that influence these old parts of the brains, like which is the superior colliculus in mammals, but is called the tectum in older animals, evolutionarily older animals. So in the monkey and human world, tasks can be quite rich. They have people reaching around or making eye movements that are quite complicated. But then when people move to rodents, which are a super powerful tool for dissecting the neural circuitry, they went to simpler tasks in general. Either just like lick or don't lick, or like lick to the left or lick to the right, or turn your head to the left or turn your head to the right. So they're very, very simplified. And what we've done in my lab is kind of bridge that gap a little bit by creating this a slightly richer sort of world for them to play in, where we have many ports. And so we can ask them, like, move from here to here, or move from here to the same target, so different direction to same target, or move from here to here and here to here, so it's the same movement, but from a different position in the world. And so that allowed us to untangle whether planning was in like the representation of where the goal is in space in the world, or where am I moving relative to myself. And what we found was what we thought we would find is self-centered representations, because we thought that we were studying an area that was a lot like the primate frontal eye field, which is centered at the center of gaze. But then we also found these world-centered representations, which people hadn't really described before in frontal cortex. And we're still trying to understand those representations. We don't really know exactly what they're doing there, what their functional contribution is. I think there's this Bob Wirtz and Mark Summer, who are fantastic researchers about like planning eye movements in monkeys, have done this work on when you're planning a sequence of movements, you kind of need to keep track of the error as you're doing it. Like if you made a little bit of a mistake in the first one, you want to correct for that, right?
Yeah.
So if you only plan in vector space, you can accumulate your errors. So what you want to do is you want to like plan, but then after you've made your movement, kind of check based on sensory cues or something, like how close, like how far off was I? And then you want to update your next vector plan to correct for that error.
So let me speculate a bit.
Yeah.
So very tactically, I would imagine the rodents or any mammal wants to get to the food or get away from the predator.
Yeah.
And sort of localized information is probably more useful. But then the world-centered view, as you say here, has strategic benefits. So suppose I, keep collecting information as I go for food or get away from predators in a more holistic perspective. At some point, it's going to be beneficial. And so, in this sense, it's sort of a data collection mechanism with the expectation that it could be beneficial in the future. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So the lingo that we kind of use is the idea of this cognitive map, which is like a very old idea, and has been revitalized several times. And sometimes now we talk about like, you hear this jargon like model-based planning in the reinforcement learning literature, which is very closely related to the idea of the cognitive map. And I think it's exactly what you said. It's expensive to store everything in this abstract reference frame, but it's very useful if you want to be able to simulate or, I mean, it is simulation in a sense, right? You're just sort of saying like, instead of doing an action, seeing what happens, you can simulate it in your head, imagine it, plan it, and then see, oh, I think that will happen if I do this, so that's a bad outcome. I'm not going to do it. That's a great survival mechanism, right? So,
It's a great survival mechanism. So you say here in neural network model comparison supports the view that despite the presence of world-centered representations, the FOF, which is frontal orienting field,
yeah.
receives the target information as self-centered input and generates self-centered planning signals. Um, we will talk a little bit about this. I think this also has implications for humans, not just rodents. I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, that result. So what we did in the paper is we trained. So we found in the rat brain these different world-centered and self-centered reference frames,
Yeah.
and we thought, well, okay, can we use artificial neural networks to better understand the computational role of these different features? And so we trained four artificial neural networks, recurrent neural networks, to do the task that the rats did. So they saw an
Mm.
image, and then they had to plan and make a movement. And two of the networks received input in a self-centered reference frame, meaning like wherever their nose was, that's it was like a camera that moved, right? And then another set received kind of more like the bird's eye view style image where
Mm.
if the target was over here, like they just always saw the same picture and the targets moved around. And
Mm.
then the networks either had to say in XY coordinates relative to self where they need to go, or relative in the world coordinates, like pixels in space. And so we had a two versus like so there it's a 2 by 2 grid. And
Mm.
then so what we expected was that if you present the image in self-centered coordinates and you ask it to produce self-centered outputs, that we wouldn't see any world-centered representation. Because
Mm.
if you're if you really care about if the network really cares about saving energy or like having as only representing the things that are really useful, you
Yeah.
wouldn't have it in there.
Yeah.
And so what we realized was that like and we didn't push on this that much. Like we didn't say, oh, if we enforce sparsity by penalizing activity and penalizing this and penalizing that, can we get it? Can we
Mm.
remove the spurious information? We were just saying like, look, in a way, it was more of a cautionary tale, which is just like when you observe things in the brain through fMRI or electrophysiology or any other correlational method, you cannot say that that is driving behavior because we know for sure that network wasn't using that out world-centered information,
Mm.
and it's still there. And the reason it's there is because it's in the input. It's just like there's no the network didn't have a strong reason to like filter that out because it wasn't hurting it in doing the task.
But it
Does
could
that
be
make
useful.
sense?
It could be useful in the future. So,
Well,
so
the
for
network
instance,
doesn't know that, but if for an animal, yeah.
yeah. So if you find some correlations, let's say, I just make this up, Jeff. I know nothing about this. So if you find some correlations between sort of the local um, objective function and sort of the strategic noisy information coming into it, you find some correlations. You say, well, I could now predict in the future, or I can have a baseline before I go into the next cage or
Yeah,
hunt for the
a
next. Yeah,
prior, yeah, I believe, yeah.
yeah. Really interesting research, Jeff. So I want to go into another paper. You say here more than just a motor, reason surprises
Hmm.
from the frontal cortex. We talk a
Yeah,
little bit about this. So motor and premotor cortices are crucial for the control of movements, for the control of movements, sorry.
yeah,
However, we still know little about how these areas contribute to higher order motor control, such as deciding which movements to make and when to make them. Here we focus on rodent studies again and review recent findings, which suggest that in addition to motor control, neurons in motor cortices play a role in sensory integration, behavioral strategizing, working memory, and decision making. Yeah.
yeah.
So it makes a lot of intuitive sense. But the question has always been, how does it do it? I mean, it seems so complex, you know. But the brain is a complex instrument, and
Right.
so what do you find in this?
So I should just say, by the way, that paper was there was a symposium organized by a colleague, the first author of the paper, Christian. And so we had a workshop at the Society for Neuroscience meeting, and this was kind of a summary of the workshop. So it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
exactly like work from my lab. It was this collaboration between many different labs. I think that so one of the things that I think we are as a field coming to grips with is that even though there is modularity of function,
mm,
if you lesion visual cortex, you impair visual processing. If you lesion auditory cortex, you impair auditory processing. If you just look at the kind of information in visual cortex and auditory cortex and motor cortex, it is very messy. Like there's
mm,
sensory information in motor cortex, there's motor information in visual cortex. Um, and I think and this is a point that that I think we tried to make in this paper a little bit, although we actually made it also in another paper. But a lot of what the brain is doing is prediction, and I think you've
yeah,
talked about that on the podcast before.
yeah, yeah.
And when we move, which we're always moving because we're animals,
Mhm.
we're generating predictions about how the world, how the sensory information will change
Yeah.
due to our movements. And because of that, of course, sensory information has to be like in motor cortex, and motor information has to be in sensory cortex because it's a loop. It's a loop, right? It's like it's not like
Mm,
we move and then we see and then we move, then we
mm.
see. It's like I think
It's continuous. Yeah,
there's this phrase called active sensing, which I think
yeah.
uh, a, is not very trendy right now, but I think it's actually important. And I think I definitely think of the brain as like a control system,
Mm,
and so there's a very tight feedback loop,
yeah,
and so yeah, so I think we don't really understand exactly like why certain areas have some specific function. I mean, it's really easy for early sensory areas like the
mm,
information from the eye comes in, it goes to certain parts of the brain, those areas are visual. But then you get a few synapses in and you're like, okay, why is parietal cortex specialized for this and prefrontal cortex specialized for this? Or like
yeah.
different areas of prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal, medial prefrontal. It's like so we know it has something to do with the anatomy, but it's I think uh, we're still really in the early days of understanding
Yeah. So
this kind of thing.
yeah, I always believed in this, Jeff. So I think AI is this is not research, but I just want to get your perspective on this. So
Yeah,
AI takes a reductionist approach to this. You say, I'm going to get a 1 million samples. I'm going to run it through some sort of deep learning network, and then it can learn if it's a cat
yeah,
or a dog. That's
yeah,
fantastic. And it's progressing further. But I don't think the brain does that. Yeah, the brain needs to see only one cat or a dog. I mean, it's a
right.
what we call in AI. It's a single shot learning
Yeah,
process,
yeah,
and I don't think we have done that in computing. Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot more modularity in the brain, and I mean, yeah. So I think there's a lot of interesting work on this. Brains have millions of years of evolution that generate a lot of biases and inductive biases and like built evolutionary priors, so that makes it probably easy for us to
Yeah.
learn a lot of things. Yeah, and I think uh, you know there are there's a technique in AI called like mixture of experts,
Mm.
where you sort of like train many separate agents and then you use a kind of a weighted mixture
Some
of
sort of
their
voting mechanism to reach a decision. Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
I think the brain does probably has something like that also.
Mm.
Um, where there's definitely a lot of redundancy in the brain, which is why sometimes when you enact silence or lesion some area, you can see very fast recovery, uh, even like on the order of minutes or something, where we don't
Mm.
think that's like the time scale of plasticity, of synaptic plasticity.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes you silence an area and there's no behavioral effect, but for other reasons, you have strong reasons to believe that it maybe is really driving, like causally involved. So I think there's a lot of redundancy
Mm.
and modularity because of the way evolution built the brain. Like it's like
Yeah.
in evolution that hardly ever throws things away. It's just like add something on top, right?
Yes.
Um, so I think that is something, we're still gonna
Yeah.
we can learn
So
from.
yeah. So you mentioned evolutionary priors. So I find very interesting, Jeff. So I want to just get your perspective on it. So you say here we suggest that these seemingly disparate functions may subserve an evolutionary conserved role
Mm.
in sensor motor cognition, and that further study of rodent motor cortices could make a major contribution to our understanding of the evolution and
Yeah.
function of the mammalian frontal cortex. So, yeah, so uh, these analogies are not exceptionally good, but so if all the computers come with Windows 11, uh, and Windows 11 has set of apps
Uh-huh.
already there.
Yeah.
Um, in our case, in the human case, they might get Windows 11, but it is sort of a noisy Windows 11. There's some commonality. As you call it,
Mm.
evolutionary priors. We know run away from the lion. Um, Maybe cats are okay. That type of stuff. Um, but then we do have diversity in that operating system. That makes a problem really interesting, right?
Mm.
Yeah. What do you think?
So I'm not. So let me see if I understood what you're
Yeah.
asking. So there's two separate questions. One is about individual differences
Yeah.
between people of a single species, and then the other is about like what you can learn from across species. And those
Yeah.
things are not totally unrelated because if there's a lot of diversity within a species, it may be hard to find like principles which you
Hmm.
can then generalize to a different species.
Some heuristics. Yeah. Heuristics and generalize.
So were
Yeah.
you asking more about like inferring across species, or were you asking more about the individual differences?
No, I haven't really thought through this, Jeff. So
I see.
you can take it where you think is
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
So I think, so you asked about AI, and obviously everyone is like excited about AI. And
Yes.
I'm excited about AI also a little bit afraid. But I think like one of the things that I want to remind your listeners and is that we don't just study neuroscience to understand intelligence. We study neuroscience to understand how the brain works so that when it fails in aging, in neurodegenerative disorders, in stroke, we can do better because we're not doing great in terms of uh, a lot of these syndromes and
Yeah.
diseases when it comes to brain, the diseased brain. And
That's
so,
interesting, Jeff. So may I ask you a quick question? So
yeah,
that sounds to me that you're interested in the hardware, the machine that we are carrying on top of our bodies. And that hardware has a lot of issues. As we age, it creates a bunch of problems. But then, is it the right way to think about it, though? I mean, is it you know at some point can we install a new operating system? After you turn
right.
90?
So
Yeah.
right now, the best tools, well, okay, so I would say right now, the best tool we have is some kind of pharmacology, drugs. And so if we can better understand, let's say, I'm working on motor planning and motor function is impaired in a lot of in Parkinson's and other age-related disorders, right? So if I can better understand the unique contribution of specific cell types and the kinds of receptors that those cells express, then I could, and this is this is probably not like my own work, it's like the field, but in 20 years, and maybe with AI assisted drug discovery and AI assisted analysis of the details of the specific cell types in that play a role in cognitive function, we can get closer to designing specific drugs. Maybe they're proteins, maybe they're, there's a lot of challenges crossing blood-brain barrier. There's a lot of challenges. But I think that I just want to sort of say, like, neuroscience is important for studying the human brain because we want to solve these disease and psychiatric and neurologic disease. Whereas the questions about AI in the brain, they're fun and they're super exciting right now. But that's not, I just want to point out that it's not for some of us that for the main funders, like in England, the Medical Research Council, the reason they're funding neuroscience research is because of disease, not to figure out how one-shot learning works.
Yeah, completely. I'm not a big fan of AI, Jeff. Just
I see.
And even on the hardware side, it's interesting. I was in a large pharmaceutical companies in the 90s.
Okay.
And when human genome mapping happened,
it was overpromised.
We all thought, all diseases are going to be cured in 2 years.
Yeah.
When two guys won the Nobel Prize for protein folding algorithm. Sounds interesting, but we haven't seen anything come out of that. So humans tend to jump ahead based on computing, based on data, based on programmatic intuition. But we have generally found almost nothing translating to the biological system. I'm making it very
I mean,
black and white.
I think that's a little bit pessimistic. I think it's absolutely true that the Human Genome Project was overhyped, but I think we did learn a lot, and I think the technology that they really pushed in terms of like cheap sequencing, that's invaluable, and we're using it all the time because we do genetic
testing. From a data
testing.
gathering perspective, it's clearly useful.
And so AlphaFold, you're kind of, that's what you were mentioning, the Nobel Prize for protein folding. I mean, it's such a recent discovery. So I'm not a synthetic biology person, but from my understanding of it, it is absolutely transforming that field. Like the before and after in synthetic biology, it's just like a new world now because they have this library of things to test and build on. So I actually am optimistic that AlphaFold and the related outputs of that work will be transformative for health in human disease. But you should invite Demis Hassabis or the other guy on the podcast to talk about
it. By the way, Jeff, I don't believe many of the things I say. I'm just trying to get
be provocative. Okay.
So I want to get into another paper, which is all of these are very interesting. So mice dynamically adapt to opponents in competitive multiplayer games. You say here competing for resources in dynamic social environments is fundamental for survival and requires continuous monitoring of both self and others to guide effective choices. Yet our understanding of value-based decision-making comes primarily from studying individuals in isolation, leaving open fundamental questions about how animals adapt their strategies during social competition. So I wasn't going to take this here, Jeff, but we will just take a detour and we'll come back.
Sure.
So consciousness, for instance,
consciousness
seems like an ability to understand somebody else's mind or somebody else's thought processes. And so from that, I conclude that an AI machine that is unable to do that cannot get to intelligence without consciousness is impossible, I would argue. Let's take a quick detour and then come back to your paper. Yeah.
Yeah. I I like I'm an armchair philosopher. I enjoy philosophy. I've read the integrated information theory papers of Tononi, and but I'm not definitely not an expert. My I kind of subscribe to the Daniel Dennett view of consciousness that it's
Yeah.
just like if you have enough modules, working memory and planning and introspection and things like this, eventually you kind of but
It's an
I,
emerging property. So I haven't quite, I didn't talk to Daniel before he passed away, but
mm,
so he's saying it's an emerging property. So you get to sufficient complexity and then consciousness will emerge.
that I mean I'm not going to speak for him, but that's my kind of shallow understanding of it. And
Yeah.
it's a look, consciousness is a great mystery, but I guess I will say I disagree with your claim that you
Yeah.
need consciousness for intelligence. I mean, I think that's
Hmm.
sort of just obviously not true because I think these new LLMs are intelligent. They're fantastic. I mean, they're better than a lot of my undergrad students at a lot of things. Um, but but I don't think they're conscious. I mean,
Yeah.
someone asked me recently, and I said, well, we don't even know really how to define consciousness in humans in a really rigorous way, so it's going to be hard for us to figure out when AI is consciousness. And I don't, you also mentioned something about theory of mind, and I think this is actually a little bit of a misunderstanding. You didn't use that phrase, but you were
Yeah.
essentially talking about theory of mind, the idea that
Yeah. Yeah.
I need to have a model of what you're thinking.
Yes.
And there are certain behaviors where theory of mind is important, but for a lot of behaviors, theory of mind, I think, is not strictly required.
Hmm.
If I model you as an object in the environment that has a
Yeah.
certain pattern, and I can learn the statistics of your behavior, I don't know if I need a model of you as an agent.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So you could do some unsupervised machine learning on my behaviors, find some patterns, and that might be sufficiently robust to
Exactly.
predict what I'm going to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about this. Yeah.
So I think people kind of, so a friend of mine, Mike Doris, when he was a postdoc in Paul Glimcher's lab, who's one of the kind of fathers of neuroeconomics, they had a
Yeah.
paper in 2004 where they had monkeys playing a game, like in the Nash sense of a game, where they were
Yeah.
like playing a computer and they had to kind of choose whether to, it's called the inspection game, but it's not that important, but they had to like choose one of two options. And the reviewers were like, this is impossible because everyone
Mm.
had sort of assumed that playing these games required theory of mind. But
Mm.
you can actually show that a reinforcement learning agent with no theory of mind,
Mm.
when when they play iteratively, they
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
do one shot. They can't play one shot. But if you let them
Sure.
play iteratively, they
Yeah.
find the Nash equilibria.
Yeah. That's really interesting, Jeff. So, yeah, I haven't really deeply thought about this. So, what you're saying is that you come from one side. You say, if you don't understand the other individual, you don't have intelligence. And you come from the other direction. You say, well, all I need is a lot of data. And then I find the patterns this
Yeah.
individual is all about. And I can make reasonably robust predictions about this individual. So if my goal is predictions, let's say,
Yeah.
I can do that. A machine can do that. So the larger question then, yeah, I haven't thought about this, Jeff. I'm just making this up so you can object to this. The larger question will be, can you understand an individual from the pattern data? I
Yeah.
don't, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
So I think for me, understanding comes from bridging levels of description. Um,
Yeah.
so if I say, uh, well, that person stole my bike or whatever. And then I think, okay, well, why did they need to? They were in a rush and they needed a ride, and so they took it that one time. Then I don't really have to worry about them. It was just like one act of desperation versus like, oh, they sold it, and then I understand that they're like doing it as a way to make money, and then they're a bike thief basically, right? So there's like so I can kind of say like think about proximal causes and like what's the so I mean I don't know. I guess my is I think I lost the thread. The question is about intelligence versus understanding, right? I think yeah, these are deep questions. And I guess when we're talking about mice competing or a
Yeah,
squirrel competing,
yeah,
um, I don't know if I don't know how I mean we haven't studied this rigorously, but it's not clear like how much a difference in their behavior it would make if they had
yeah,
just prediction or if they
yeah.
actually had like theory of mind.
Yeah, this is a deep thought, Jeff. I have to think more about this. So, yeah, so it could be just pattern finding, and pattern finding results could look remarkably
Exactly.
good compared to somebody who has a theory of mind. So you say here, we found that mice integrate real-time spatial information about self and the opponent to flexibly shift their preference towards safer, low payout options
Right.
when appropriate. So there is a game theory aspect to this, in addition to theory of mind. So on the surface, this seems like intelligence, but if I understand you correctly, what you're arguing is that this is sort of a data problem in the sense that if I get a lot of data, I can be
Yeah.
quite effective. Yeah.
So for me, I don't know. I guess like intelligence is a bit vague as well. To me, intelligence and intelligent behavior and adaptive behavior are almost synonymous.
Yeah.
And I would say that the mice behavior is adaptive in the evolutionary sense, meaning it's like helping them achieve a high level of fitness in survival. So I would say that even with I wouldn't say theory of mind is a prerequisite for intelligence.
Yeah.
And I would say the thing that we were the result that we found, I mean, it's a bit hard. It might be hard for the listeners without really describing the task to kind of get this. They can look at the preprint. But the general idea is that we cue the animals using visual cues where rewards are available.
Yeah.
And so there's a stimulus comes on, like a visual cue comes on,
Yeah.
and there's a good one and a bad one. And so when they're on their own, they learn like, oh, I should go to the good one because it's better, and they go almost all the time. But when there's another mouse in the environment, if the other mouse gets response first, then that ends the trial. So the slower
Mhm.
mouse gets nothing. Okay, so then
Okay.
it becomes strategic if you're closer to the worse option to just
Mm.
take it. Even though when you were in the environment on your own, from that
Mm.
position, you would have actually gone to the better option. So that's what we mean. And then that decision to
Mm.
switch from like going a little bit further to the high one versus going
Mm.
closer to the low one depends on where the opponent is. So when the opponent is far from the patches, as we call them,
Yeah.
then you just go to the good one. But if the opponent's close, you go to, and this decision is very rapid. It's made in like a few hundred milliseconds. So
Yeah.
um, I think this is, it's one of these results where half of the people you talk to will say, well, this is obvious because this is what
Yeah.
animals do in nature. Like, of course they could do this. And then half the people you say are like shocked that mice are so smart. And it's like, and actually, I usually find that that's a good sign that you found something interesting if half the people say it's obvious and half the people are shocked.
Is there a penalty, Jeff, for the bad decision? So what I'm thinking is that if I sort of envision this
Hmm,
on the x-axis, the timing of a decision, on the
yeah,
y-axis is the reward of that
yeah,
decision. And if there's no penalty, I just sit there and I hit the thing as fast as I can because there's no penalty, that's fine.
No.
Yeah.
So one thing is that there's many ports all around, and they
Yeah.
don't know where it's going to be, so they can't sit in one
Mm.
spot and just go to it because
Okay.
it
Yeah.
jumps around, and they don't know
I
where it's
see.
going to be. That's essential, actually. That's
Okay.
essential.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah. So this is again kind of arguing that you need sort of more complicated environments in order to see really interesting behavior emerge. If the task or the setting is too simple, then animals can, just as you suggest,
Yeah.
just get like a really silly strategy of just like no no
Yes.
no 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 no, no, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that
Uh,
was part of the so this was work that was done with my wife and collaborator Antoine, and like I think it was she when we moved to England, she really wanted to do this social decision making, and then
mm.
we kind of like worked together to find something that was, uh, I guess, intuitive enough for the mice that they could show this really interesting behavior without a lot of overtraining, and
Yeah.
so I think it's exciting.
Yeah. Really interesting. So I want to conclude on this paper. So you say here, using a dynamic mode of neural activity, we found that in addition to opponent effects, decisions under competition, they're
Mm,
also noisier and more sensitive to initial conditions. That's intuitive, generating testable predictions for neural recordings and perturbations.
right.
Together, this work reveals a fundamental mechanism for competitive foraging and proposes novel quantitative frameworks towards understanding value-based decision making in a fast-changing social environment. Yeah, so um, in some sense, we can take all biological models and parade them on a spectrum, but it seems like they have foundational properties, from human to a rat. The foundational properties, you called it sort of evolutionary um, aspect to it. The foundational qualities seem to be pretty shared, right, between these biological models.
Yes, I think you know the so there's so to unpack that a little bit. So there's the models that we use in decision making. So there's cognitive level models, and like the most popular or one of the most popular cognitive level models is called the drift diffusion model. And the
Hmm.
idea is that you model decisions as like a particle that's like drifting toward one bound or another, and when it hits that bound, you've decided to go left versus right. So like that you
Hmm.
have a right bound and a left bound, and that your noise is like how uncertain something to do with your certainty, and then how quickly you drift has to do with how strong the evidence is, things like that. And then that is people have mapped that to what are considered more biological frameworks, and the most popular or one of the most popular biological frameworks that kind of links that cognitive level description, or you could say algorithmic description, is this dynamical attractor dynamics. So the
Hmm.
idea is that you have a population of neurons representing the decision to do one thing versus another thing. Let's say go left, go right, or choose the good option versus the less good option. And they inhibit each other. So they're kind of in a winner take all circuit. And the dynamics of that mutual inhibition are very close to the dynamics of the drift diffusion model, and which has made people really excited about
Hmm.
these attractor models.
Yeah.
And um, and actually, the Nobel Prize this year was given to John Hopfield for this kind of work, the attractor dynamics. And so that we use those models in all species,
Hmm.
in humans, monkeys, rats, mice, even people use them in fruit flies.
Hmm.
And because I think, and I think part of it is that they reflect sort of a fundamental computation which
Hmm.
any organism has to do, even regardless of the detailed implementation.
Hmm.
So a fly it has to navigate, it has to forage for food, it has to find mates. Like fundamentally, like the behavioral repertoire of a fly is a subset in a way of the behavioral repertoire of a human, right?
Yeah.
And so if we're
Yeah.
studying similar behaviors, I think it's natural that we find that similar models are effective across species.
So in other words, they're all running Windows 10 from the fly to the human. They might have some fancy apps, when you get to the human thing. But
Right.
generally speaking, the heuristics and the technology underneath appears to be
Right.
reasonably similar. Would you agree with that?
Right. I would say I guess something that I would say like the mouse could be like a Raspberry Pi running like a bare bones Linux, and then the human is a gaming system with a very fancy. No, I think the idea is that there's core computations that are shared across all organisms, and probably even non-animal organisms that I think there's interesting behaviors in trees and slime molds, and that you can also probably model with similar dynamics.
Yes, I want to go another paper, Jeff. So this is sort of
Yeah,
related. The rat frontal orienting field, FOF,
yeah,
dynamically encodes value for economic decisions under risk. So you say here frontal and parietal cortex are implicated in economic decision making,
that's true.
but their causal roles are untested. Causal roles, I should say, are
Yeah,
untested. Here we silence the frontal orienting field, FOF, and posterior parietal cortex, PPC, while rats choose between acute lottery and a small, stable, sure bet. PPC inactivation produce minimal short-lived effects, but FOF inactivation reliably reduce lottery choices. Yeah,
yeah,
this is really interesting. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this in the next paper. So these are translatable effects, I would imagine, to humans.
yeah. So this work is closely linked to the first paper we talked about, which was on the 2D plans, 2D maps for plans.
Yeah.
So, like I said, there's this frontal parietal network that people associate with spatial attention, self-centered spatial attention, and strokes that damage these networks often cause these attentional neglect, where
Hmm.
people, you ask people to draw a clock and they draw all the numbers on one side, or they
Hmm.
like you give them like a plate of food and they only eat the food on one side of the plate, and then you can tell them, well, like, okay, turn the plate and they can eat another half, and it's actually quite devastating.
Hmm.
It's so we need to understand these networks better,
Yeah.
and so that's largely why we've been studying them, and there's been some long-standing mysteries, like we're going more than 20 years now, where when you record from these frontal areas and parietal areas, you see very similar patterns of neural activity. They
Hmm.
encode memories or plans for upcoming eye movements or upcoming arm movements. But strangely, in the animals, when we do short, like very precise lesions or temporary lesions, like either
Hmm.
with drugs or with cooling, in general, the parietal effects are very subtle and the frontal effects are very
Hmm.
strong. And we still don't really know why this is. And there's some really interesting work. But so
Is
one,
so sorry, Jeff. Sorry to interrupt. So the exec sort of decision making is on the frontal part. We don't
I,
know.
I
Yeah.
mean, we think that I think the general view is that these frontal areas are closer to the motor output, and the
Okay.
parietal areas are closer to the sensory input.
I see. Okay.
But they talk a lot to each other, and they
Hmm.
have a lot of common patterns of activity. Um,
Okay.
yeah, and
As I
so
said, we
we
got 15 people in our head.
yeah,
You got to
exactly,
satisfy all of
exactly,
them. Yeah.
exactly. So we had previously done this work in a perceptual decision making task, where you just hear a sound and you have to say, like, is the sound like it's coming from the left or the right, something like that.
Yeah.
And in that task, if you record from both areas and by the way, this is like pretty, you get the same results in monkeys and rats, more or less.
Yeah.
You can record from both of the areas and say what the animal is going to do at the end of the stimulus. So you can sort of predict their upcoming choice based on the activity. But when you silence, you see a huge difference. When you silence frontal activity, you see a big change in behavior. When you silence parietal cortex, it's very subtle. So we thought, but there are some tasks that are very sensitive to parietal manipulation. And one of them is if you just like flash two lights and and then one is a little bit earlier than the other, and everyone kind of looks at the first one they see. That's just a natural behavior. And if you silence one hemisphere of parietal cortex, you can shift the bias. So now, like, I'm biased to look to the left.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is sometimes called the onset asynchrony task. And so and we showed in rats that parietal silencing, it does bias this kind of task. And I was just kind of like scratching my head, like, why is it when they're like doing this thing for reward that the parietal cortex doesn't have an effect, but when it's like not so much about reward, but only about like a sort of attention, maybe there is an effect. And so we thought, well, maybe the parietal cortex. Well, there are sort of two main reasons for the study. One is just like there's a lot of questions also about, is motor planning in frontal cortex really motor planning, or is when we see signals that we think are motor planning in frontal cortex, it's really just about like allocating attentional resources to certain objects or parts of space. And that once that allocation of attention becomes high enough, you orient or you reach. So that's kind of drove us to do this kind of manipulation of a value and look at these areas.
Yeah. So I don't know if I understand this correctly, Jeff. So is there a bias? So the two hemispheres, the left and the right, from the very little I know, the left is more logical, has language, that type of stuff. The right is potentially more empathetic, more holistic. Holistic is a bad word. I don't know what it means, but so is it that there is a left-right competition here, right? In some ways, so the right is sitting back. I'm just making this completely up out of thin air. The right is sitting back and saying, "Okay, so I saw one signal. Let's see the next signal, and then we'll make a determination." But the left is up and running already. I mean, I saw it. That's all I need.
So this is in humans. So this is actually in humans. There's quite a bit of evidence for lateralization. In rodents, there is some evidence for lateralization of function, but it's not as nearly as lateralized as humans. And when we silence left versus right frontal cortex, we see essentially symmetric effects. Like when you silence the left frontal cortex, they don't want to go to the right because it blocks the contralateral movement. So, and we see but the size of the effect is pretty symmetric. So I don't think that can explain the rodent results. In the humans, there is quite a bit of active research into separately studying the effects of damage of right parietal cortex from left parietal cortex because of these. I mean, okay, not so much the froofy, like more feely and more logical, but there are clear asymmetries in the human brain, and so that's important when you're dealing with a stroke patient to know whether it's like a left parietal or right parietal stroke. But that, I don't think that can explain the non-human results.
So unrelated, Jeff. So do you think that was for efficiency reasons? As the biological mechanism got more complex, bigger brains, more complex brains, the brain couldn't do all the stuff everywhere.
You mean why is there lateralization?
Yeah, lateralization. Yeah.
I mean, that's absolutely outside of my expertise, but I know that some people think it has to do with tool use.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That is what with development of dexterous tool use that people would just like pick up an axe with one hand or
Hmm.
throw a spear with one hand, and that sort of like triggered a
Oh,
whole sequelae
okay.
of lateralization. But that is wild speculation. No one
So
knows, I don't
interesting.
think.
So I
Yeah.
want to finish up with this one.
Yeah.
So you say here time preferences are
Mm.
reliable across time horizons and verbal versus experiential tasks.
Yeah.
So you say here individual differences in delayed discounting correlate with important real world outcomes, for example, education, income, drug use, and criminality. As
Mm.
such, delayed discounting has been extensively studied by economists, psychologists, and neuroscientists to reveal its behavior and biological mechanisms in both human and non-human animal models. So, yeah, so as I mentioned, Jeff, I did some work in this area, very peripheral work um, from the economic side.
Okay.
And so I spent 30 years, trying to teach um, senior decision makers in large companies
Mm.
that their decision making processes might be inefficient.
Right.
I didn't get too far. And and my hypothesis is that humans have this additional feature. I don't know if rats and mice or
Mm.
other biological systems have. It's called ego. And so in finance, we have this concept called sunk costs. Whatever decisions you made in the past, it's not going to help you in the
Yeah.
future idea. But most managers cannot get away from it.
Right.
Uh, and so humans have a set of baggage that
Yeah.
they bring to decision making. And my intuition is that mice and rats might be much more efficient.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Yeah.
So I think, you know, that was a great intro for why we wanted to do that study. Um, there's a, as you quoted, there's a lot of serious societal costs to like impulsivity, drug addiction, bad financial decisions, criminality. All these things are kind of associated with impulsivity and like lack of sort of being inconsiderate of your future self, because
Yes.
that's essentially what it is, right? So, by the way, there is a study that rats and mice do show sunk costs.
Hmm.
David Reddish published this work. It's interesting. It's somewhat controversial,
Hmm.
but it's quite interesting. But I absolutely agree with you that um, animals tend to be have less distractions in their, well, so humans are a storytelling species, as you
Yes.
know. That's what you mean, I guess, when you say ego. It's like we have a story about ourselves, and it's very expensive for us to integrate new evidence that makes us question our stories about ourselves. And so that's whenever you're studying humans, you always have to worry about that extra stuff.
Or even question status quo, right? So
Right.
I
So
think,
so what
yeah.
yeah. So for us, like we think it's really important to use animal models to study the neural mechanisms of these economic decision making. And what we wanted to do before we sort of started on that research program was to ask, like, when a rat is making a decision about a delayed reward, is that anything like what a human is doing?
Yeah, yeah. So
And
interesting.
And so we thought, well, what's the first thing we can do? He said, well, let's train humans just like rats.
Yes.
So give them a computer. We'll sit in front of a computer. We won't tell them anything. They don't, all they're told is that they're like doing an economic study. They don't know it's about delay discounting. And all
Yeah.
we tell them is when you see coins on the screen and you hear like ching, 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 that's real money. Like you'll get paid every time you hear that sound, you're going to get paid. And so
Hmm.
try to make as much money as possible. And then, and then we taught them a kind of just the way we teach rats, like a relationship between some auditory cues and then the size of the reward and the delay to the reward. And so using that, we could assess their delay discounting in a
Yeah.
way that was, we thought, relatively unbiased, because they didn't necessarily know what they were doing. And so they weren't like, oh, I should be pretending. So one problem in psychology studies is that they often ask people, hypothetically, would you rather have $10 today or $100 next year? And people are like, well, hypothetically, I'd like to be a person that saves money, right? But then in actuality, they're not a person that saves money. So when you ask people hypothetically, you often don't get the right answer. You have to actually make people what the economists call incentive compatible choices, which means,
Well, Jeff, I have to say it depends on interest rates. So if I
yeah,
get $10 today
sure.
and I invest it, you know.
Yeah, exactly. It does depend on interest rates. So we that was the goal of that study, was to kind of take humans, treat them like rats, and then use the same people, bring them back a few weeks later, and then use the more typical verbal task. So it was the same choices, but now we just say, like, do you want to wait a
Yeah,
minute for 10 cents, or do you want, 5 cents immediately? And
yeah.
then we brought them back a few weeks later and then turned it into days. So instead of doing it in seconds, we did it in days. And what we found was that there was not a big difference in their, when we looked at the most impulsive person, when they were doing it like a rat, was still the most impulsive person when they were
Mm.
doing it in words. Um, and so that made us feel like, okay, there may be some core construct of impulsivity which expresses itself across domains. Now, that said, I do want to mention work from, um, I can't remember who the senior author is, but there was this huge study. One of the papers was published in PNAS on whether lab studies of impulsivity
Yeah.
are worth anything, and the answer was like no, basically.
Mm.
So you give people like a ton of lab studies, then you estimate their discounting, and then you
Mm.
ask them, how impulsive are you? And they report it. And then you look at their credit card bills,
Mm.
and their self-report is more accurate about their actual behavior than all of the in lab
Mm.
studies. And I think it's like a wake up call for the field.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think we need to be really sort of think carefully about what we're studying when we study
Yeah.
things in
Yeah.
the lab.
Yeah. There's a lot there. So Jeff, I was just thinking about this. Um, so we'll finish up with this. Uh, so people who have some sort of addiction,
Mm.
I'm thinking alcohol or drug or something like that, right? I wondered, this is not in your research, but I wondered if you take that cohort, a clearly biased cohort, obviously,
Mm.
if their decision-making processes are substantially different from the control group. My
Yeah.
intuition is that it is potentially quite different. What do you think?
So there's a lot of data on this, and
Okay.
it's not my work, but it's very controversial. So there's several studies saying that uh, addicts are rational decision makers.
Hmm.
They just really, really like the drugs that they're addicted to. So if you offer them enough money, they
Yeah.
will take the money instead of doing cocaine or whatever.
But the utility functions are, sort of very biased, so it has to be big money for them to come
Yeah, but
out of.
that's still rational from an economic
It's rational.
perspective.
Yeah, it's totally rational.
Exactly. So I think, but then there are other people. I mean, I don't know. I again, like you said, that's not my field, but from my reading of literature, I think it's a probably addiction is not one thing, and there are some
Mm.
addicts that are, I mean, they use drugs and they might not be addicts, but they might be drug users who are rational. And then there might be people who are truly addicted who are irrational. I think
So sort
all
of
of us,
utility maximizers. So that's sort of interesting, right? So I mean, you have to first define utility, what this individual is trying to do. And
Exactly.
clearly, it's not the general public's utility, but the individual's utility.
Right.
And the decision making, as you say, is rational in the sense that he or she is trying to maximize um, her or his utility.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So
But
I
I don't think
wonder.
you need
Yeah.
addiction to think about this. Like we all of
Yeah.
us have this feeling where like, we want to eat the cake and we don't want to eat the cake. Right?
Yes.
So I
Yes.
think this conflict between sort of like first order desires and second order, like I don't want to eat the cake, but I want to eat the cake. And I think you don't need to be an addict to understand that tension.
Yeah.
And I don't think as neuroscientists we understand that tension that well because it's very hard in animals to ask them what their second order desires are. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
we only know what they choose. We don't know what they want to choose.
Yeah.
So I think this is a very hard problem to like get to the neural basis of it. But it's
Really
super
hard problem.
interesting. Super
Yes. I mean,
interesting.
can you design an experiment where you can get to a mouse or a rat to tease that out somehow?
Uh, Come back to me in a year. I'll think about it.
I mean, that'd be
Yeah.
so fascinating, right? So, um, non
Yeah.
human mammals, we believe, are also thinking. They're making, I mean, we see them making decisions.
Yeah.
A lot of them are reasonably optimum, perhaps. I'm just making a statement. I don't see any data, um, but then given multiple alternatives on a decision process,
Yeah.
how do they sort of parade those alternatives in terms of utility?
Yeah. That's something that
Difficult to
we're
understand. Yeah,
we're working on now.
yeah,
We have some I don't think I sent you any of those, but it's like active work. We just
yeah.
actually presented some of this at a recent conference, but we have some rats choosing between many alternatives,
Hmm.
and we're trying to understand how it's represented and how context, like the presence of third options, influences choice. And so there's some interesting stuff. And in terms of this, I mean, I'm stepping back a bit on my claim. Like, even in the study, the competitive study that we discussed,
Yeah,
we do see something where it's like, if let's say the mouse is here and the good option is here and the low option is like on the way,
yeah,
and they kind of know themselves. They go, if I get really close to that low option, I'm just going to pick it. So I'm going to walk away from it. And
yeah.
and we haven't
Oh,
studied,
wow. Okay. Yeah,
we
that's
haven't systematically looked for how often they do this. But when we watch the videos, we see that it looks like they kind of do this, where they're like, I I don't want to get like trapped by that bad decision, so I'm gonna avoid the temptation,
yeah.
which is really interesting. So we don't know if that's.
So I don't know whether you talk about this or I read somewhere. So
Mm,
um, let's say we have set of options, and suppose the individual wants to limit those options
mm,
on the fear that given all those options, I'm going to make a future decision incorrectly.
yeah,
Because I'm going to the first decision point and say, I got 15 things here.
just take away
Uh,
some of them.
yeah, I'm going to just focus on two.
Yeah.
I think humans do that, right?
So that is a very effective. I think the evidence is that that's a very effective decision strategy. Instead of trying to pick your favorite of 15, decide for sure which ones you don't want.
Yeah, yeah.
And so just reduce the choice set. And then when you get down to two or three, then it becomes easier to focus your attention on the features that are important to you. Whereas like trying to think about all the 15 options at the same time,
Mm.
it's a kind of overwhelming. I mean, this is like the paradox of choice, right? This is like you go to the grocery store and there's like 50 toothpaste and you're just like, you don't actually care which one you get, but you still stand there and you're like, I don't know which.
It's costly. It's costly to make a
Exactly.
decision. That's the issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent, Jeff. Yeah, this has been great. Yeah, thanks so much for spending time
Cool.
with
It's
me.
fun. All right.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this so late in London.
No problem, no problem. I look forward to seeing it